All right, welcome back to the channel. So, I'm sucked into this. I can't get away from it. Roy Jones Jr. says something about Mike Tyson that piqued my interest, so let's rap about it. Roy Jones Jr. says that he can knock out Mike Tyson in this exhibition match that's coming up. Let's talk about what Roy Jones Jr. had to say and the positive side of Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. and an interesting observation or two that I think you'll like or you'll find interesting. Let's talk about those things in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. We're going to talk about a fight that ain't nobody ever asked for, but somehow we're getting and people are excited about. And that is the fight between Iron Mike Tyson and the great Roy Jones Jr. About 20 years too late. About 20 years too late. Because about 20 years ago, this fight would have been one of the biggest fights in the history of boxing. Roy Jones Jr. was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Mike Tyson, legendary heavyweight who can definitely spark you out if he lays his hands on you, intimidating, scary Mike Tyson. Back in 2000, he obviously still was not still Mike Tyson, right? He ain't been Mike Tyson since about 1991. I think when did he lose to Buster Douglas? Like 92? But I think right around 1991 or something was around the time that Mike Tyson, was no longer Mike Tyson. But in the year 2000, that fight would have been on and popping. However, this ain't the year 2000. This is the year 2020, and you're getting two old men hopping in the ring, fighting each other. But it can be exciting. And Roy Jones Jr. says something that made me, he actually got me. He actually got me thinking and wondering about this fight. Because on Fight Hype, and I don't know if the interview was on Fight Hype or if Fight Hype is, taking an interview that might have been on Instagram and put it on there. But regardless, I saw it on Fight Hype, so go check out Fight Hype. They asked Roy Jones Jr. about, what is he gonna do if Mike Tyson does something crazy, right? He says, well, shoot, if Mike Tyson's going to do something crazy, I'm going to do something crazy. But he said, Mike Tyson's going to do something crazy. It's Mike Tyson, right? It's like, I'm waiting for it. Mike Tyson's going to do something crazy. And I believe that he's right because Mike Tyson is crazy. Mike Tyson that dude is kind of off, man. So I wouldn't be surprised at the age of 54 if you pushed Mike Tyson the wrong way, then Mike Tyson wouldn't just flat out lay you out. Or if he's in a boxing match and he gets frustrated, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he bit Roy Jones. You know what I mean? If it was a real fight. And if you know the saying, if was a fifth, we would all be drunk. But this if ain't no fifth. And this is supposed to be having headgear. This is supposed to have headgear and big boxing gloves. I have a suspicion, though, that they might take that headgear off, dude. That they might. Because that just seems to be so not Mike Tyson. You know what I mean? That seems to be so not Roy Jones Jr. Now, like I said, something could happen crazy from Mike Tyson with him biting, but then Roy Jones also could get knocked out, even with that headgear. Like even with the headgear. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Mike Tyson just ran through him with an arm and an elbow and knocked him out. Mike is that off. Now, but what Roy said, which is something that I had not thought of before, is like, man, Roy Jones can knock out Mike. He said, man, I can knock out Mike Tyson too. Because he's like, pound for pound, right? Pound for pound skills will beat brute strength, right? Now, that took me back to, and y'all gotta forgive me for time skipping, right? Back to the conversation about in 2020. So like back, I mean, not in 2020, in 2000. So like in the year 2000, there might have been a chance that Roy Jones Jr. could have knocked out Mike Tyson in 2020, in the year 2000, before he lost to Roy Tarver. I mean, to Antonio Tarver, and he was he was still at 200 pounds. If Mike Tyson would have fought him at that point in time, there is a chance that a chance Roy Jones Jr. could have beat him. I mean, and the reason that I say that is, one, Mike Tyson's not a tremendously big heavyweight, right? He's not tremendously big, and he didn't at that time have the fastest feet in the world, but what he did still have was very quick hands and very heavy hands. But Roy might have been able to stay out of the way of that, might have been able to feint his way out of that, might have been able, and maybe he could have caught Mike Tyson with something like that leaping left hook. Now, because I was at the fight with when Roy Jones Jr. won the heavyweight title against John Ruiz. Funny story though, I met Emmanuel Stewart, and I asked Emmanuel Stewart, rest in peace, on his way out because he was looking for a limo, and me and my friends had a limo. So he went up to the limo driver and was like, "Hey, are you for hire?" And obviously he was with us, but we asked Emmanuel Stewart what he thought about Roy Jones and John Ruiz. And man, I had never heard him cuss like that, man. That man said, man, John Ruiz is a piece of shit. He's just a guy. I was like, dang, he went off on him. He's like, man, that dude is just trash. That's what Emmanuel Stewart said. So I always think about that when I think about Roy Jones in that particular fight. But I saw it at that point in time, maybe there was a chance because, Roy was still at his peak. And like I said, Mike Tyson was 7 years off of his. Maybe that could have happened. But now, even if you didn't have the gloves, right? Dude, I mean, especially if you didn't have the headgear, Roy Jones Jr. ain't moving like Roy Jones Jr. used to move, right? So, Mike Tyson, he's not going to be a million miles away from Mike Tyson at any point in time, man. And as long as within the first 3 rounds, man, Roy Jones Jr. could get hurt in them first 3 rounds. But now as it goes on, right? When you get to round 7, round 8, round 9, all of that, that's where I think things could get kind of funny for Mike Tyson, because if it was a real fight, because when you announce a fight with a joint in your mouth, like I signed my contract, dog. Yeah, I don't know, dog. And I'm not buying all of this. I'm still not buying his physique thing, because Mike Tyson's just a metamorph. His body can be built like that because he was probably built like that when he's 14 without lifting any weights. That's just how the dude's built. But, all in all, man, when Roy Jones Jr. started talking about it, right, and we're getting a little bit further away from the announcement for the fight, because like my beef with the announcement for Roy Jones Mike Tyson was the fact that it was announced right around the time that the Showtime cards were announced, with Gervonta Davis and Leo Santa Cruz, the Charlo brothers fighting Jason Rosario, Derevyanchenko, and that fight, like that, I thought that should be an exciting moment for the sport of boxing when we know that boxing is really back, because boxing's really back when you start naming real fights, real fights, and giving dates to real fights, not these crazy, stupid mismatches that we're getting over there at ESPN, or the crazy, ridiculous mismatches that I understand that we're on DAZN. Boxing's going to be back when the real fights come about. So I wasn't too happy that it's like they got overshadowed. The Showtime card got overshadowed by Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson. But as time moves, I'm further away from that particular incident taking place, the more I'm like, you know what, man, it's going to be nice to see. It'll be nice to see Roy Jones Jr. walk in the ring. It'll be really exciting to see Mike Tyson, in his robe, getting out of the, walking with his towel. He probably ain't gonna have a robe, with his head cut out with the towel, walking out there looking like an animal. He gonna look like an old animal, but he gonna look like an animal, So I gotta admit, I'm getting a little excited about it, man. I'm getting a little excited. it doesn't make me want to get into a boxing gym and start throwing no hands because I'm younger than both of those dudes. But it does say, hey man, maybe us late 60s, us late 1960s kids still got a little gas in the tank. Maybe we can make the world shine up for, make the world happy with our athletic abilities, one more time. Something like that, dude, because, hey man, you only live once and there's only so many legends in your life, man. And, Roy Jones Jr. is a legend. Mike Tyson's a legend. So seeing the guys in the ring doing something with, hey man, it's worth the money for me. I'll pay the $50. Also, I certainly hope that it can lead to, Mike Tyson selling a lot of his product, right, and all that. And I hope that it gets Roy Jones Jr., a lot of money in his bank account, open up other things for him because, those guys really did in the 90s, in the 90s. Well, Mike, it was 80s and the 90s, 80s and the 90s through the 2000s. Man, they really did give us a lot of really, really great memories. And it's great to see these two guys celebrated. You know what I mean? Now, the only thing that I would like to see, though, is, hey, man, how about we celebrate? How about that saying where you give people their flowers when you're alive? How about we give some of these new fighters, the fighters that we have that are in their top, in their prime, how about we give them their flowers when they're still fighting, right? Like a Terrence Crawford, like a Gervonta Davis, Errol Spence, Guillermo Rigondeaux, guys that, that really are giving us really entertaining moments, but the mainstream media, just ain't in love with. Same way that situation was with Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson. Because if you followed Roy Jones Jr. career, HBO made dang near a full-time living crapping on him, and he was the best fighter on their network. Same thing goes for Mike Tyson. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. We chopping it up about this boxing today. Thank you for chopping it up with me. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Hit the like, share, subscribe. If you're not subscribed, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Much love in the Patreon to everybody who supports on the Patreon and the channel members and the live streams. And with that, we out.